There are some nights that feel cursed from the first crack of thunder. This was one of them. Wind battered the walls of Rachel Evans's small farmhouse, making the old wood groan like some restless beast. Rain hammered the windows so hard it sounded like fists pounding to be let in. In the dim, flickering glow of a single lamp, Rachel moved through the living room, her bare feet silent on the creaky floor, clutching a worn blanket to her chest. Every so often, lightning would flare outside, illuminating the battered furniture and the worried face of her daughter. "Mom, I heard it again," Maddie whispered, eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the back window as if expecting the darkness itself to burst inside. Maddie was 6, with wild curls and a heart as soft as fresh dough. But tonight she trembled like a leaf. Rachel forced a smile, pushing back her own worry. "It's just the wind, sweetheart. Storms make all kinds of spooky noises." She draped the blanket around Maddie's shoulders and brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "Why don't we—" A low, mournful wail rose up through the crash of thunder, so faint Rachel wasn't sure she heard it at all. Maddie's grip tightened around her mother's arm. "There, did you hear? Please, Mom, someone's out there. Someone's crying for help." Rachel shook her head, feigning calm. "It's probably a coyote, or an owl maybe." But the lie fell flat even to her own ears. They lived in the middle of nowhere, a patchwork of forest and fallow fields, hemmed in by the old railroad tracks. Coyotes were common, but this sound was different. Longer, more desperate, almost pleading. "Not an animal," Maddie insisted, her little voice trembling. "It's someone sad and scared, and he needs us." The storm raged on, as if daring them to venture outside. Another boom of thunder rattled the glass. The power flickered, dimmed, then steadied again. Rachel tried to reason with her daughter, to explain that it was dangerous to go out in weather like this. But Maddie was already inching toward the back door, gaze fixed on the blackness beyond. Rachel's nerves were shot, but she couldn't ignore Maddie's fear or her stubbornness. The girl's instincts were usually sharp, uncanny even. She remembered the time Maddie found a stray kitten under the porch after insisting for hours that something was waiting for her. Rachel wondered, just for a second, if tonight might be another one of those times. "Sweetie, stay here. I'll check the porch." "No, he needs me now." Before Rachel could react, Maddie yanked the door open. Cold air and rain slapped them both in the face. For a heartbeat, the night was just wind and wildness, leaves whirling, the garden gate banging loose on its hinges. Then Rachel heard it. A raw, broken howl drifting up from the tracks behind their yard. It wasn't the voice of any coyote or fox. It was the sound of something in agony, something lost. "Maddie, stop!" But Maddie was already a flash of pink pajamas darting into the storm, her feet squelching through the mud as she headed for the fence at the edge of their property. Panic surged through Rachel. She grabbed a flashlight, her phone, and bolted after her daughter. The rain was a living wall, blinding and icy. Each step was a battle, mud sucking at Rachel's shoes, grass whipping her legs. The wind stole her breath, whipped her hair across her eyes. "Maddie!" she screamed, but the wind shredded her voice, carrying it away. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant Rachel saw the world thrown into sharp relief. Gnarled trees, the sagging fence, and Maddie's small silhouette running headlong toward the railroad tracks, arms pumping. Another howl, closer now, almost underfoot. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest as she crashed through the gate and stumbled after her daughter. The railroad tracks gleamed like silver veins in the night, slick with rain and littered with fallen branches. Maddie stood at the edge, scanning the darkness, water streaming down her face. Somewhere off to the right, Tangled in a patch of weeds, something moved. Large, dark, writhing in distress. "There, over there," Maddie pointed, voice nearly lost in the storm. Rachel's flashlight found the source. A German shepherd, huge and soaked, its fur matted with mud. It was chained directly to the tracks, the heavy steel biting into its neck. Every time the dog struggled, the chain pulled tighter, and the animal let out a keening, hopeless cry that cut straight through Rachel's soul. For a split second, Rachel stood frozen, horror warring with disbelief. Who would do something like this? She dropped to her knees beside the dog, fumbling with the chain, her hands slipping on the wet metal. Maddie threw herself over the animal, wrapping her arms around its thick neck, ignoring Rachel's cries to move. A new terror rose, the distant, unmistakable blare of a train horn. The tracks shuddered beneath their feet. Rachel's hands bled as she fought the chain, but it wouldn't budge. The storm, the train, Maddie's frantic sobs, the dog's wild, pleading eyes. It all spun together in a nightmare blur. For a moment, Rachel thought they would die right there, her daughter in her arms, both of them undone by one monstrous act of cruelty. Then, out of the storm, a figure appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with desperate purpose. He carried something gleaming, bolt cutters. Without a word, he knelt beside Rachel, snapped the lock with a single, brutal motion, and yanked the chain free. The German shepherd collapsed, legs buckling, but Rachel scooped Maddie into her arms and staggered away from the tracks just as the train roared past, shrieking and deafening, shaking the very earth. Rachel clung to her daughter, heart pounding, the world reduced to rain and adrenaline and the blessed, impossible relief of survival. The stranger crouched over the dog, muttering reassurances, checking its injuries. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain hammering the leaves and Maddie's soft, shuddering sobs. Finally, the stranger turned, eyes fierce in the glare of the flashlight. "You saved him," he said, voice rough. "But now they'll come looking for all of you." The night swallowed his words, leaving Rachel with a chill far colder than the storm. The real danger, she sensed, was just beginning. The world was washed in silver and black, the storm easing but not gone, as Rachel gathered Maddie and the injured dog into her trembling arms. The stranger, soaked to the bone, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, hoisted the dog's heavy body as if he'd done it 100 times before. Lightning flickered in the distance, momentarily illuminating the deep lines of worry carved into his rugged face. "We need to get inside. Now," he barked, scanning the tree line as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the darkness at any moment. Rachel nodded. Clutching Maddie's hand so tightly, the girl let out a yelp. She didn't loosen her grip. The stranger half-carried, half-dragged the German shepherd up the muddy path, with Rachel and Maddie stumbling close behind. Once inside the farmhouse, Rachel locked the door and shoved a chair beneath the handle for good measure. For a few heartbeats, the only sounds were the rain drumming on the roof, Maddie's quick breaths, and the harsh, uneven gasps of the dog sprawled on the floor. The stranger knelt beside the animal, gently probing its legs and ribs. Blood oozed from a wound on the dog's shoulder, matting the fur into dark clumps. "Do you have a first aid kit?" the man asked, his tone clipped but not unkind. "In the bathroom, top shelf." Rachel moved to fetch it, heart still racing. She forced herself to focus. Gauze, antiseptic, towels, water. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from replaying the horror on the tracks. While the man worked, Maddie sat cross-legged at the dog's head, whispering softly. The German shepherd, enormous next to her, gazed back with tired, haunted eyes. Maddie's voice was low, a gentle litany, as she stroked the dog's muzzle. "It's okay. You're safe now. We won't let them hurt you. Rachel returned and knelt beside the man. Up close, she noticed the scar running through his eyebrow and the haunted look behind his eyes. He glanced at her, as if weighing whether to say more. "Name's Logan Reed," he finally muttered, stripping off his soaked jacket. "I live a few miles down the road in the woods. Heard the train, then saw your flashlight. Lucky I keep tools in my truck." He cleaned the dog's wound with steady hands. Rachel tried to collect herself, but her voice shook. Why would anyone chain a dog to the tracks?" Logan's jaw tightened. He hesitated, then checked over his shoulder to make sure Maddie was out of earshot. Not just anyone. Brent Sawyer's men. The dog was marked for death. He kept his voice low, dark with anger. "Sawyer runs illegal security out here. Dog fighting, guard dog training. Real nasty work. That shepherd, he must have refused to do something. Maybe turned on them, or maybe he wouldn't attack someone. Sawyer doesn't tolerate weakness." Rachel shuddered, watching Maddie whisper to the dog. "Who is Sawyer?" Logan's expression darkened. "Local crime lord. Everyone pretends not to see, but he owns half the cops in 3 counties. Years ago I worked for him, before I knew what he really did. I got out, but..." His voice trailed off. "Sawyer doesn't forget a grudge." Thunder rumbled in the distance, softer now, as if the storm itself were listening. Rachel's mind spun. "So we're in danger, just for helping this dog?" Logan met her eyes. "You didn't just help a dog, you embarrassed Sawyer. His men will want payback, for the dog and for crossing him." Maddie looked up, her face luminous with a kind of fierce innocence. "His name is Shadow, he told me." She glanced at Logan and Rachel with complete certainty, as if this was as obvious as the rain outside. Rachel wanted to laugh, but the dog's eyes flickered up to Maddie. And for a split second, Rachel felt something, a kind of understanding. "Shadow," she repeated quietly. The dog thumped his tail once in response. Logan finished bandaging Shadow's wound. "He's lucky you found him. I'll stay here for a bit. Make sure he doesn't go into shock." Rachel nodded, grateful and overwhelmed. She found an old comforter and made a bed for Shadow near the fireplace, where the coals still glowed from earlier that night. Maddie refused to leave his side, whispering stories, promising that he'd never have to be scared again. Rachel tried to busy herself, making tea, straightening the kitchen, anything to chase the anxiety gnawing at her gut. Logan wandered the small house, checking windows, peering into the darkness. "Sawyer's men won't stop," he warned quietly. "If they know you took Shadow, you're a target. They might already be watching." Rachel felt a wave of dread. "Should we call the police?" Logan shook his head, lowering his voice. "Not in this county. Sawyer's got people everywhere. You need to lay low, at least until Shadow can move. I'll help you." As the hours crawled by, the storm finally began to let up. Rachel dozed in a chair by the fireplace, her body heavy with exhaustion. She awoke to the sound of Maddie's voice in the pre-dawn hush. "He's scared, Mommy, but he knows we're good. He says thank you." Rachel glanced over to see her daughter curled up beside Shadow, her small hand resting on the dog's huge paw. Logan was awake too, sipping coffee in the kitchen, eyes red from lack of sleep. He came over and crouched beside Rachel. "If you have anywhere to go, friends, family, now's the time. I can help get you there. Sawyer's people, they don't forgive." Rachel shook her head. "This is our home. We're not running." She looked at Shadow, then at Maddie, and felt a strange surge of defiance. "We'll fight if we have to." Before Logan could respond, Maddie sat bolt upright, her gaze fixed on the window. "There's a car out there," she whispered. Rachel's heart leapt into her throat. Logan grabbed the flashlight and killed the lamp. Through a crack in the curtain, Rachel saw headlights glinting on the far edge of their property. A black SUV, engine idling, two shadowy figures inside. "They found us," Logan said grimly. "We have to move, now." Rachel's world narrowed to a single cold thought. The storm had passed, but the real danger had only just begun. Daybreak arrived slowly, seeping into the Evans farmhouse like a cautious guest, coloring the battered walls with the pale light of a storm-washed morning. For a few precious hours, the world seemed quiet again, if only on the surface. The rain had faded to a gentle drizzle, painting the window panes with delicate streaks. In the living room, Rachel watched her daughter and the dog they'd saved, her heart torn between awe and fear. Shadow lay stretched on the old comforter by the fireplace, his breathing labored but steady. Maddie was curled up beside him, one arm flung protectively across his back. She looked so small compared to the massive German shepherd, but something about the sight, her wild hair, the bruises on her knees, her stubborn, gentle presence, made Rachel's chest ache with a mother's pride and worry. Rachel knelt quietly, trying not to wake them, and placed a hand on Maddie's forehead. Her daughter's eyes fluttered open. "He's still scared," Maddie whispered, her voice hoarse from crying but steady with conviction. "But he knows we love him." Rachel brushed the hair from Maddie's face, wishing for the 100th time that she could protect her from all the dangers in the world. "You did something amazing last night, kiddo." Maddie shook her head. "We all did." She turned back to Shadow, murmuring something that sounded more like a lullaby than words. Logan appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, eyes red-rimmed, hair a mess. Still, he managed a small, encouraging smile as he handed Rachel a mug. "How's our patient?" he asked, nodding toward the dog. Rachel exhaled. "Hanging in there. Maddie seems to think she can talk to him." Logan leaned against the doorframe. "Kids know things adults forget." He glanced at Maddie, then back at Rachel. "When I worked for Sawyer, we trained dogs for security, intimidation, fighting, anything that made money. Shadow, he was special, smarter than most, but he wouldn't attack a kid during one of the tests. Just laid down between the man and the child and refused to move." Rachel blinked, startled. "He protected a kid?" "Yeah, and that made him useless to Sawyer. Kindness isn't a trait he values." Logan's jaw tightened. "The order came down to put Shadow down. Guess the guys figured they'd make it hurt." Rachel shuddered. "That's monstrous." "That's Sawyer." Logan's voice was hard as stone. He hesitated, lowering his voice. "I tried to get Shadow out, but they caught on. I had to disappear. I've been trying to gather evidence ever since, but Sawyer's reach goes deep. You need to understand. Last night wasn't a one-off. He'll want Shadow dead, and he'll want to make an example out of anyone who gets in his way." Rachel felt the gravity in his words, the edge of desperation. "What do we do? For now, heal up, lay low, and be ready to run." Logan looked at Shadow, then at Maddie, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Your daughter, she's got something special with him. I've never seen a dog bond like that, not even with the trainers." Maddie, oblivious to the adults' conversation, continued her quiet murmurs. Shadow, for all his injuries, looked calmer with her than he had at any other moment. When Maddie put her hand on his flank, the big dog's tail thumped weakly. Rachel decided to distract herself with action. She moved to the kitchen, searching for something to feed their unexpected guest. Maddie followed, determined to help. They found some leftover chicken and cooked rice, which Rachel carefully cut into small pieces. As they worked, Rachel watched Maddie out of the corner of her eye. Her daughter was humming softly, the same tune she'd used to soothe Shadow through the night. It struck Rachel that Maddie had barely slept, yet her eyes were clear, focused. Once the food was ready, Maddie carried the bowl to Shadow, kneeling beside him. "It's okay," she whispered. "I know you're hurting, but you're not alone." Shadow sniffed the food warily, then, with Maddie's gentle encouragement, began to eat. Logan returned with a small first aid kit and some old towels. Together, he and Rachel cleaned Shadow's wounds as best they could. Rachel's hands shook, but Logan's calm presence steadied her. She found herself opening up, sharing stories about Maddie, about life since her husband left, about the loneliness of this house at night. Logan listened, nodding, offering a few stories of his own. He talked about the guilt he carried for his years with Sawyer, about the moment he realized he couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. "Sometimes the hardest thing," he said quietly, "is admitting you need help." Rachel met his gaze, feeling a strange, fragile sense of connection. For a moment, it felt like the storm had driven them together for a reason. Maddie interrupted the silence with a sudden declaration. "Someone's coming." Rachel looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" Maddie's eyes were fixed on the window, her face pale. "Shadow says he can feel them. Bad people. They're close." Rachel exchanged a nervous glance with Logan, who immediately crossed to the window and peered out. At first, nothing but mist and empty fields. Then, at the far edge of the property, just beyond the old barn, a black SUV sat parked, its engine idling, two silhouettes barely visible through the fogged-up glass. "They found us," Logan muttered. He reached for his backpack, pulling out a battered old handgun, checking the magazine with practiced hands. "We need to be ready. If they come up the driveway, we can't fight them head-on, not with Maddie and Shadow here." Rachel's mind spun with possibilities: fight, run, hide, but every instinct screamed to keep Maddie safe. "What if we just leave, take the back road through the woods?" Logan nodded, tension in every line of his body. "It's risky, but maybe our best shot. I know a place, a hunting cabin about 6 miles from here. Isolated, well hidden. We can hole up there for a while." Rachel glanced at Maddie, who still knelt beside Shadow, her small hand resting gently on his head. "Will you be okay to move, buddy?" she asked softly. Shadow, as if understanding, pushed himself upright with a groan, favoring his wounded leg, but ready to follow Maddie anywhere. Rachel quickly packed a bag, essentials only: water, snacks, a flashlight, the first aid kit, extra clothes. Logan mapped out their route on a scrap of paper, showing Rachel the narrow deer trail they'd have to take. As they prepared to leave, Maddie looked up at her mother, her voice low and certain. "Shadow says he'll keep us safe." Rachel managed a shaky smile, praying her daughter's faith would be enough. Minutes later, as dawn broke over the drenched countryside, the small group slipped quietly out the back door. Maddie leading the way, Shadow limping beside her, Logan scanning the shadows, Rachel glancing back at the only home she'd ever known. The storm had broken, but a new, more dangerous journey had just begun. The cold air of dawn bit at Rachel's cheeks as she led Maddie and Shadow away from the only home she'd known for the past 7 years. Her backpack weighed heavy on her shoulders, stuffed with hastily gathered essentials. Logan moved ahead of them, eyes sharp and posture tense, a silent promise of protection in every stride. Behind them, the black SUV lingered, silent and menacing on the edge of their property. Rachel forced herself not to look back, gripping Maddie's small hand with an urgency born of pure maternal fear. They kept to the deer path at the rear of the property, where wild brambles clawed at their legs and wet leaves turned the ground slick. Maddie, surprisingly sure-footed, followed Shadow as if the two of them were guided by some invisible thread. Rachel tried to keep up, glancing over her shoulder with every rustle in the brush. Logan took the lead, making quick decisions at every fork, guiding them away from anything that resembled a road or human settlement. Within the hour, the trees grew thicker, the ground rising and falling in uneven humps of moss and roots. Rachel could barely see the sun through the dense canopy, but she felt the day warming as adrenaline slowly ebbed from her veins, leaving behind exhaustion and a gnawing dread. Occasionally, she heard the faint growl of an engine, Sawyer's men circling, searching, the threat always a little too close. Logan seemed to sense it too, signaling for silence whenever the sound drew near. Maddie would freeze, her hand clutching Shadow's fur, the big shepherd pressing himself protectively against her leg. At one point, Logan motioned for them to duck behind a fallen tree as a pair of headlights flashed through the forest, sweeping the trunks in ghostly light. Rachel held her breath, heart hammering, while Maddie pressed her face against Shadow's shoulder. The SUV idled for a moment, as if sniffing the air, then rolled away. Only when the sound faded did Rachel let herself breathe again. They pushed deeper into the woods. Maddie led Shadow along the narrowest parts of the trail, always choosing the path least likely to leave tracks. More than once, Shadow paused and sniffed the air, guiding them to circle around patches of open ground or double back to avoid suspicious tire ruts. Rachel marveled at the silent coordination between her daughter and the wounded animal. It was as if they were tuned to the same secret frequency. Finally, after hours of trudging through muck and thickets, they reached the edge of a small clearing. There, half concealed by a tangle of fir trees and boulders, stood a weathered log cabin with an old tin roof and a shuttered porch. Smoke stains marked the stone chimney, but there were no signs of recent habitation. Logan signaled the all clear. "Welcome to my humble hideout," he whispered, unlocking the door with a battered key. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. Rachel let out a long, shaky breath. They were safe, for the moment. The cabin was simple. One main room with a wood stove, a threadbare couch, and a small kitchen. Logan showed them where to find bottled water and canned food in the old pantry. He checked every window and door, making sure the locks and boards were secure. Maddie immediately settled Shadow onto a pile of blankets near the stove. The dog curled up, exhausted but alert, his ears twitching at every sound. Maddie sat beside him, her knees drawn to her chest, staring into the flickering light, as if listening to voices only she could hear. Rachel made soup on the old stove, her hands steadying as the mundane rhythm of cooking took over. She and Logan spoke in hushed tones while Maddie dozed, Shadow's huge head resting in her lap. Logan explained more about Sawyer, the network of criminal activity, the fear he inspired, and the evidence Logan had been collecting for months. "I kept files hidden in a safe here," Logan admitted, glancing at a small metal box bolted to the floor in the corner. "Enough to put Sawyer away if the right people see them. Problem is, Sawyer owns half the right people. If he finds us before we get this out, we're as good as dead." Rachel's throat tightened. "So even the police can't help?" "Not the local ones," Logan said quietly. "But I've got a contact with the feds. If we can get the evidence to him—" A sharp bark from Shadow interrupted him. Maddie's eyes snapped open, wide with alarm. "They're coming," she said softly. Rachel peered through the blinds. At first, she saw nothing but the forest. Still, green, deceptively peaceful. But then, between the trees, a distant glint of glass, a windshield catching sunlight. Logan sprang into action, shoving the files into his backpack, gathering their things. "We need to be ready to run again," he said. "If they find the cabin, they'll burn it down around us." As the afternoon wore on, tension settled over the group like a second storm. Every sound outside seemed magnified. Every crack of a twig or flutter of wings made Rachel flinch. Maddie barely spoke, except to whisper reassurances to Shadow, whose hackles remained raised, eyes fixed on the door. By nightfall, Rachel tried to sleep on the couch, but every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the headlights outside, the shouts of angry men. Maddie, unable to rest, kept her hand on Shadow's back, her breath in sync with his, as if drawing courage from his presence. Sometime after midnight, a soft, scraping sound at the back window jolted Rachel awake. Logan was already moving, silent as a shadow himself, gun in hand. Rachel pressed Maddie and Shadow close to her as Logan peered through a crack in the boards. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a flash, a silhouette ducking away from the window, followed by hurried footsteps crunching in the underbrush. Logan listened, every muscle coiled tight. Eventually, the sounds faded, replaced by the familiar chorus of crickets and distant thunder. "They're checking the perimeter," Logan whispered. "They'll try again at first light." Rachel drew Maddie close, the weight of fear heavy on her chest. "We can't keep running forever." Logan knelt beside her, voice gentle but urgent. "We just need to hold out until I can get this evidence to my contact. Once Sawyer goes down, his men will scatter." Rachel nodded, but doubt gnawed at her. Could they really survive another night? Could she keep Maddie safe in a world that suddenly seemed so cruel? Yet as she looked down at her daughter, at Shadow curled protectively around her, she felt a spark of hope. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees, a promise of both danger and resilience, carrying them deeper into the wild, and toward whatever fate awaited them at dawn. The dawn broke gray and heavy, the mist lingering among the ancient pines that surrounded Logan's hidden cabin. The world outside was silent, a brittle kind of quiet that settled into Rachel's bones and refused to leave. Every sound, every crack of twig, every distant cry of a bird sounded like a threat. Rachel lay on the battered old couch, one hand wrapped around Maddie's shoulder, the other clenched tight around the flashlight she'd never thought she'd need in daylight. Logan was already awake, moving quietly through the cabin. He peered out the windows with the tense focus of a man who'd spent too many years watching for danger. Rachel watched him check his pistol, reload, and tuck the weapon into the back of his jeans. It struck her how natural he looked in this moment, alert, burdened, haunted by the responsibility of keeping them all alive. Shadow paced by the door, limping but determined, ears perked. Maddie sat beside him, whispering gently, her eyes wide and shining in the half-light. "They're close," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Shadow feels them. They have machines, the kind that find people." Rachel's heart skipped. She glanced at Logan, who nodded grimly. "GPS. Sawyer has trackers, maybe even dogs. They could find us by scent or by the old radio frequencies. We have to move. Now." Rachel's hands shook as she packed their meager supplies. Bottled water, canned beans, a single flashlight, Logan's secret files. Outside, the world was a green maze, fog clinging to the low spots. Logan led them out the back door, down a deer trail so narrow even the light had trouble finding it. They left behind the only shelter they had, trusting that their footprints would vanish in the undergrowth. They had barely reached the riverbank when the first sign of pursuit crashed through the morning. An engine revved. Closer this time, angry, Rachel whipped around in time to see figures moving at the edge of the trees, black jackets glinting, voices barking in the distance. Logan pressed a finger to his lips, signaling silence, then led them down to the river's edge. The water was high from last night's storm, a rushing brown torrent, swollen and fast. Maddie hesitated, her hand tightening on Shadow's collar. Logan knelt, face to face with her. "We have to cross," he said. "Shadow will go first. Then you, then your mom. Hold tight, no matter what." Shadow limped into the water first, his powerful body fighting the current. Maddie followed, boots slipping on the slick stones, breath ragged. Rachel waded in after, the cold hitting her like a slap. Logan came last, pushing Rachel ahead, one eye on the riverbank where Sawyer's men were closing in. They made it halfway across before a sharp cry rang out. A gunshot, splitting the air. Rachel screamed for Maddie, who lost her footing and went under. In a heart-stopping instant, Shadow spun, teeth bared, and lunged into the swirling water, grabbing Maddie's jacket and pulling her to the far shore. Rachel, nearly swept away herself, crawled out behind them, lungs burning. Logan stumbled as he came out last, a deep cut on his arm bleeding heavily. "Keep moving," he hissed, dragging himself up the muddy bank. "We have to get to the mine." They ran, battered and soaked, Shadow leading the way into the tangled forest. The howls of dogs echoed behind them now. Sawyer's men had released their own hounds, their baying chilling Rachel's blood. Maddie tripped and fell, skinning her knees, but Shadow nudged her up, refusing to let her stop. At last, they reached a low rise where the trees thinned out, and the ground dipped toward an old, overgrown mine entrance. Logan doubled over, breathing hard, the blood from his arm staining his shirt. "This way," he groaned, shoving aside a pile of rotting boards to reveal a narrow tunnel mouth, half hidden by blackberry brambles. Inside, the air was cold and dank, thick with the smell of earth and rust. Rachel pressed close to Maddie, her heart pounding as Logan staggered behind them, flashlight flickering. Shadow shook off the worst of the water and pressed ahead, tail low but determined. They hurried through the twisting darkness, their footsteps echoing against stone. Logan collapsed against the wall, gasping. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I didn't expect them to find us so fast." Rachel tore a strip from her shirt and bound Logan's arm as best she could, hands clumsy with fear. Maddie crouched beside him, holding Shadow close, tears streaking her muddy cheeks. "You saved us," she said softly. "You're brave." A crash echoed from the mine's entrance. Sawyer's men, not far behind. Rachel's mind raced. "Is there another way out?" she asked, voice shaking. Logan nodded weakly. "There's a tunnel. Leads to the old cave network. If we can reach it, they'll have a hard time finding us." They pressed deeper into the mine, the darkness swallowing them. Maddie clung to Shadow, whispering, "It's okay. You're with me. I won't let go." Shadow's body was warm against her, a living shield. Suddenly, Maddie was separated in the confusion. Rachel tripped over a pile of rubble, falling hard, losing sight of her daughter. Panic sliced through her as she screamed Maddie's name, but the echo bounced back, empty. Shadow darted into the gloom, following Maddie's scent, his barks distant but urgent. For what felt like hours, Rachel stumbled blindly through twisting tunnels, guided only by Shadow's calls and the faint, terrified cries of her daughter. At last she rounded a bend and saw Shadow standing guard over Maddie, who was huddled beneath a fallen beam, shaken but unharmed. Relief washed over Rachel so powerfully she nearly collapsed. Logan caught up, pale but determined. "We need to keep moving. They're not far behind." The group pressed onward, ducking and crawling through narrow gaps, breathless and exhausted. When at last they emerged into a network of natural caves, dawn was only a memory and the darkness absolute. Logan slumped against the wall, wounded but alive. Maddie sobbed quietly, pressing her face into Shadow's fur. Rachel pulled them both close, whispering, "We made it. We're together. That's all that matters." But even as she spoke, she knew the danger was far from over. The caves hid them for now, but Sawyer's men would not give up easily. Somewhere above, a storm raged, but deep below, in the cold dark, a flicker of hope remained. A mother's fierce love, a wounded man's courage, a child's bond with a loyal friend. Against all odds, they were still together. And for Rachel, that would have to be enough. Inside the ancient caves, time seemed to stretch and bend, hours dissolving into darkness so thick Rachel felt it pressing against her skin. Her breath was shallow, her eyes straining for any scrap of light, her heart beating a frantic rhythm she couldn't slow. Logan leaned heavily against the damp stone wall, face pinched with pain, the blood from his arm a stark reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Maddie clung to Shadow, the dog's head resting in her lap, his eyes shining in the faint beam of Rachel's flashlight. They were cold, hungry, and completely alone, surrounded on all sides by earth and the memory of men who'd mined these tunnels long before. Rachel tried to ignore the fear gnawing at her resolve. She forced herself to focus on the small tasks, rationing their water, counting the cans of beans, checking Logan's wound every hour. Each time she shined the light on his face, she saw the exhaustion and worry etched into every line. Logan gritted his teeth and tried to help, but every movement was agony. He pressed a dirty handkerchief against his wound, jaw clenched. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Didn't mean to slow us down." "You saved us," Rachel whispered fiercely. "If not for you, we'd be—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The cave seemed to swallow her words, leaving behind only the sound of Maddie's soft humming. Maddie had barely spoken since their escape, but whenever Rachel tried to comfort her, she shook her head, pressing closer to Shadow. The two seemed to exist in their own silent world, the girl's hand resting lightly on the shepherd's broad back. Every so often, Maddie would murmur something to him, half words, snatches of song, secrets no one else could hear. Rachel felt a pang of jealousy and guilt. She wanted to be the one to make things better for her daughter, but Maddie's bond with Shadow was beyond explanation. Rachel watched as Maddie closed her eyes, brow furrowed, then spoke with quiet certainty. "Shadow knows the way. There's a tunnel. It leads outside." Rachel looked at Logan, eyebrows raised. He shrugged. "There's an old legend about these mines, underground passages, some collapsing into caves. If Shadow senses something, I say we trust him." He tried to smile, but the effort cost him. They moved slowly, Logan leaning on Rachel, Maddie leading the way with Shadow at her side. The tunnel they followed was barely wide enough for an adult to crawl, choked with stones and rotting timbers. Every scrape, every distant drip of water echoed, reminding them how easily a shout or footstep might give away their hiding place. Hours passed. Their flashlight batteries faded, the beam growing weaker. Hunger gnawed at Rachel's belly, her tongue sticking to the roof of her mouth. Maddie's eyes were wide, haunted, but she pressed on, Shadow always a step ahead. At times it seemed the dog was almost guiding her, nosing gently at her shoulder when she slowed, barking softly when she veered the wrong way. At a narrow bend, the air changed, fresher, carrying the faintest hint of green. Shadow stopped, pawing at a wall of loose stones. Maddie crouched beside him, feeling the cool air with her hand. He says there's a way through. Rachel and Logan worked together, pulling away rocks until a crack opened wide enough for Maddie and Shadow to squeeze through. Rachel pushed her daughter gently ahead, then Logan, then herself. On the other side, the air was markedly fresher, the floor sloping upward. Hope stirred, fragile and urgent. For a moment they sat in the dark, catching their breath. Maddie whispered, "He's scared, Mommy. He remembers the bad men. He thinks they're close." Rachel's heart twisted at the fear in her daughter's voice, and she pulled Maddie into her lap. "You're so brave," Rachel murmured, rocking Maddie gently. "You're the bravest person I know." Maddie shook her head. "I'm scared all the time, but Shadow helps me." She looked up, eyes shining in the gloom. "Sometimes I feel like he's talking to me. Not with words, but I know what he means." Rachel's mind reeled, torn between skepticism and wonder, but the bond was undeniable. She glanced at Logan, who nodded. "Sometimes there are things we can't explain. I saw it with other dogs, but nothing like this." For a long moment, the four huddled together, sharing warmth and strength. Logan finally broke the silence. "Rachel, I have to tell you something. In my backpack, those files, I have enough to put Sawyer away. Names, accounts, photos. I risked everything for them. But if we're caught, it all goes away. If you and Maddie want to run, to hide somewhere safe, now's the time. You could leave me here, take the flashlight and the food. Try to reach the road." Rachel shook her head, voice trembling. "I'm not leaving you. You risked your life for us. Besides, Sawyer would never stop looking for Maddie, for Shadow, for any of us." The words hung in the damp air, a heavy, terrifying truth. Maddie looked from Rachel to Logan, then to Shadow. "We stay together. That's the only way." Logan smiled faintly. "You're a good kid, Maddie. Brave and smart." Rachel felt a swell of pride and fear. She hugged her daughter, promising herself that, whatever happened, she would not let Maddie down. They pressed on, following Shadow through winding tunnels. The air grew lighter, the earth less oppressive. Suddenly, ahead of them, a shaft of weak sunlight spilled onto the cave floor. Maddie let out a tiny gasp. "We're almost there!" But before they could reach it, voices echoed behind them, harsh, angry, bouncing off the stone walls. Sawyer's men. Logan motioned for silence, pressing the group into a shallow alcove. The footsteps passed close, boots scuffing against loose rock, flashlights bobbing in the blackness. Rachel pressed her hand to Maddie's mouth, feeling her daughter's breath hot against her palm. Shadow didn't make a sound, every muscle quivering with tension. After what felt like an eternity, the men moved on, their voices fading. The group waited, barely daring to breathe. When silence returned, Shadow nudged Maddie, leading her forward. They hurried the last few yards, scrambling through the narrow gap and into the open air. They found themselves on a forested hillside, the morning sun barely cresting the treetops. Rachel inhaled deeply, the fresh scent of pine filling her lungs. They were alive, battered but free, at least for the moment. But Logan's warning echoed in Rachel's ears. If we're caught, no one will ever know what Sawyer did. The files in Logan's backpack were the only hope for justice, the only way to end the nightmare for good. Rachel knew that running could only buy them a little time. Sooner or later, they would have to face Sawyer and his men. Rachel knelt, hugging Maddie and Shadow, her mind racing. She realized that the real danger wasn't just Sawyer or his men. It was the choice she faced, to run and hope for safety, or to stand and fight, risking everything for the chance at freedom. In that fragile dawn, with Maddie's arms around her neck and Shadow pressed against her side, Rachel made her choice. She would fight, not just for her family, but for every innocent soul Sawyer had hurt. She would trust Maddie and Shadow, trust Logan, and trust herself. For now, they would rest. But soon, they would move again, toward whatever future they could build together. And no matter what came next, they would face it as one. As the sunlight seeped through the canopy, painting streaks of gold across the forest floor, Rachel barely allowed herself to savor the freedom of open air. Every muscle in her body ached with exhaustion, but the adrenaline of survival pushed her forward. Maddie stuck close by her side, her little hand gripping Rachel's with quiet determination. Shadow limped but kept his head high, following Logan, whose wound was now wrapped tightly but still seeping blood beneath the rough bandages. The group paused on a ridge, crouched behind thick ferns as Logan surveyed the terrain. From this vantage point, Rachel could make out a clearing below, a narrow strip of land cut by an old, overgrown dirt road. Logan squinted, searching for any movement. "If we can reach the other side, I can get a signal out," he whispered. "There's a spot near the ridge where the trees thin. My contact with the feds will be waiting for a message." Rachel nodded, steeling herself. "Let's move fast before they realize we made it out." They slipped down the hill, moving in single file, the forest swallowing their tracks. Birds scattered from the branches overhead. The scent of pine and earth mingled with the metallic tang of fear. Maddie's breath came fast, but she didn't complain. Shadow nudged her forward, as if reminding her to keep moving. Just as they neared the edge of the clearing, Logan halted. He dropped to one knee, scanning the undergrowth. "Something's wrong," he muttered. "It's too quiet." Rachel's heart clenched. She peered through the brush and spotted the glint of something metallic. In that instant, a rough voice boomed from the trees. "Drop the bag! Hands where we can see 'em!" Logan swore, shoving the backpack toward Rachel. "Stay behind me!" he barked, raising his hands. Figures emerged from the trees. Sawyer's men, at least 4, armed and grinning. One of them held a radio, barking orders to unseen backup. Another held a shotgun trained on Logan. Rachel pulled Maddie close, shielding her as the men advanced. Shadow let out a low, threatening growl, but stayed at Maddie's side. "Well, well," the largest of the men sneered. "Look who we found. You made us work for it, Logan." Sawyer himself stepped into the clearing, his presence radiating menace. He wore a tailored jacket over jeans, his eyes cold and calculating. "I warned you, Reed. You should have stayed gone." He looked over at Rachel and Maddie, his gaze lingering on Shadow. "And there's the mutt who started all this trouble." He nodded at his men. "Bring the girl and the dog. Kill the rest if they try anything." The next seconds erupted in chaos. 2 men lunged for Maddie and Shadow. Rachel shoved Maddie behind her, taking the brunt of a blow to the shoulder. Shadow sprang up, barking and snarling, distracting the attackers. Logan rushed one of the men, grappling for the shotgun. The forest filled with the sounds of struggle. Shouts, the crack of branches, Maddie's terrified cries. One of Sawyer's men managed to pin Rachel, wrenching her arms behind her back. Another grabbed Logan, slamming him to the ground, the shotgun digging into his ribs. Maddie fought with wild desperation, clinging to Shadow's neck. The biggest man pried Maddie away, dragging her toward Sawyer. "Let her go!" Rachel screamed, her voice ragged. Sawyer just smiled, crouching beside Maddie. "You're a brave little girl," he sneered, "but you should have minded your own business. Shadow's growl rumbled like thunder. With one mighty leap, he barreled into the man holding Maddie, teeth snapping. The man staggered back, dropping Maddie, who scrambled away. Sawyer drew his pistol, aiming directly at Shadow. "You're just a stupid animal," he spat. Time slowed to a crawl. Logan, bleeding and dazed, saw his chance and surged up, knocking the shotgun from his captor's hands. Rachel wrenched free, slamming her elbow into her attacker's stomach. Maddie huddled behind a tree, hands over her ears, whispering to Shadow, begging him to run. Sawyer fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest. Shadow yelped, staggering but not going down. He stood his ground between Maddie and Sawyer, tail high, eyes blazing with defiance. Sawyer fired again, the bullet grazing Shadow's flank. Still, the shepherd did not move, did not retaliate with violence, only refused to leave Maddie's side. Logan, fueled by desperation, tackled one of the gunmen, wrestling for the weapon. Rachel used the distraction to grab a fallen branch and swing it at another attacker, catching him off guard. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, and the men recovered quickly, pinning Rachel and Logan once more. Sawyer strode forward, grabbing Maddie by the arm and dragging her into the open. "You want to save the dog?" he jeered, pressing his gun to Shadow's head. "Then watch what happens to heroes." Maddie screamed, "No, please, don't hurt him." Rachel, her voice hoarse, pleaded, "Take me instead. Leave them alone." Shadow's eyes locked on Maddie. In that moment, something passed between them. A silent message, an unbreakable bond. Shadow lunged, not at Sawyer but at the gun itself, knocking it aside with his muzzle. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the ground. One of the henchmen fired at Shadow, striking his shoulder. Shadow staggered but did not fall. Blood stained his fur, but he stayed upright, refusing to attack even as Sawyer kicked him aside. Logan, summoning the last of his strength, managed to trip his captor, seizing the shotgun and turning it on the men. "Get away from them!" he shouted, voice raw. Sawyer hesitated for the briefest instant. Rachel wrenched herself free, tackling one of the men and grabbing the gun. Maddie, weeping, crawled to Shadow's side, pressing her hands to his bleeding wound. "Please don't leave me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're my best friend. Stay." Sawyer turned the gun on Maddie and Shadow, fury twisting his features. "You all could have just walked away. But now you'll die for a mutt." Rachel, fueled by something fierce and unstoppable, hurled herself at Sawyer, grabbing his arm and twisting with all her strength. The gun clattered to the dirt. Logan rushed in, helping Rachel subdue Sawyer as the other men scrambled for cover, stunned by the ferocity of the attack. Shadow, battered and bleeding, dragged himself between Maddie and Sawyer, refusing to let anyone near the child. The loyalty in his eyes shone brighter than the pain. Even as blood matted his fur and his breathing grew shallow, he refused to snap, refused to become the monster Sawyer wanted. The confrontation ended as quickly as it began. Logan secured the shotgun, aiming it at the remaining men. Rachel scooped Maddie into her arms, holding her tight as Shadow leaned against them both, eyes closing, chest heaving. Sawyer, pinned and beaten, spat blood on the ground, glaring at them. "You think you've won? The law's not on your side. You'll never be safe." But Logan only stared back with grim determination. "We have everything we need to end you," he said. "Your files, your men, your lies. You're finished, Sawyer." Rachel pressed her forehead to Shadow's, whispering thanks and promises through her tears. Maddie stroked his fur, sobbing softly. "You're safe now, boy. You're safe." The cost of escape, of loyalty, of love, was written in every drop of blood on the ground. Shadow had risked everything to protect the ones he loved. sacrificing himself not with violence, but with a courage that refused to become cruelty. As the group huddled together, battered but alive, they knew the hardest fight was still to come. But for now, they had survived, because one wounded dog chose mercy over vengeance, and a family chose to stand together, no matter the odds. A hush fell over the battered clearing as the violence ebbed, leaving the survivors blinking in the sharp sunlight that cut through the trembling leaves overhead. The forest was silent, save for the heavy, broken breathing of Shadow and the ragged sobs of Maddie clinging to his neck. Rachel, her arms tight around her daughter, barely registered the chaos of the struggle just moments before. The world had shrunk to the circle of blood, dirt, and devotion surrounding her small family and the wounded dog at their feet. Sawyer wiped blood from his mouth, cold fury burning in his eyes. Logan, standing over him with the shotgun, watched the tree line for signs of the remaining men, his own body trembling with the pain of his wounds and the aftermath of survival. Rachel knew it wasn't over, not while Sawyer still lived, not while his men could regroup at any moment. Sawyer sneered, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You think this changes anything, Reed? You think anyone's going to believe you over me?" Logan kept the gun steady, teeth clenched against the agony in his arm. "I have everything, the files, the names. It's over, Sawyer. You'll never hurt anyone again." Sawyer laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You have nothing. No one's coming to save you out here." But Rachel's eyes were on Shadow. The German shepherd, his fur matted with blood, pressed himself protectively between Maddie and the threat, though every breath was a visible struggle. Sawyer's pistol lay just out of reach in the dirt. As the remaining men hesitated at the tree line, unsure, watching for an order that never came, Sawyer staggered to his feet and lunged for the weapon. Everything happened at once. Rachel shouted, leaping to her feet, but Sawyer was faster. His hand closed around the pistol, swinging it toward Maddie. Shadow, with a last surge of strength, flung himself in front of the girl, teeth bared, not to attack, but to shield her. "Get away from her!" Rachel screamed. Sawyer snarled, finger tightening on the trigger. "I told you. I finish what I start." But something changed in that instant. Maddie, voice trembling but fierce, stepped forward, placing her tiny hand on Shadow's neck. "Don't do it," she pleaded, looking Sawyer in the eye. "Please, he's not your enemy." For the briefest moment, Sawyer hesitated, just long enough for Logan to fire a warning shot into the air. The blast echoed through the woods, sending birds shrieking skyward. Sawyer's men, startled, bolted for the safety of the trees, abandoning their leader. Sawyer, furious and desperate, aimed his gun at Shadow again, but Shadow, battered and bleeding, stood his ground. He didn't snarl or bite. He simply looked at Sawyer, chest heaving, eyes clear with a kind of mournful courage. Even now he would not become what Sawyer wanted, a weapon, a killer. Sawyer shouted, "Attack! Attack, damn you!" His voice broke, part command, part plea. But Shadow remained perfectly still, refusing to move. The moment seemed to stretch forever. Then, with a snarl of frustration, Sawyer pulled the trigger. Maddie screamed and flung herself over Shadow, but the bullet never found its mark. Logan tackled Sawyer from the side, sending the shot wild. The two men struggled on the ground, the pistol skittering away. Rachel darted in, grabbing the gun, turning it on Sawyer just as he tried to rise. The sound of sirens, faint at first, then growing louder, rose from beyond the hills. Logan, breathless, eyes wild, looked to Rachel. "Now!" He fumbled with his phone, using the moment's chaos to finally send the evidence. Photos, files, audio clips, to his federal contact. "It's done," he gasped. "They'll have everything." Rachel kept the gun trained on Sawyer as he slumped in defeat, his bravado finally broken. Maddie knelt in the grass, sobbing, her arms around Shadow's neck. The German shepherd rested his heavy head in her lap, licking her hand in reassurance even as blood pooled beneath him. The sirens wailed closer, tires crunching on the old dirt road. Police vehicles burst into the clearing, state troopers, local deputies, and a pair of men in dark suits with badges gleaming at their belts. The scene froze for a moment. Battered, bleeding fugitives, a notorious criminal, and a loyal dog standing guard over a child. The officers stormed out, weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons! Hands up!" Rachel obeyed, dropping the pistol and raising her hands, her knees trembling beneath her. "Hutte, hands high. Let the shotgun fall to the ground." Maddie, clutching Shadow, looked up with fear and hope warring in her eyes. The two men in suits stepped forward, flashing their credentials. "FBI, we're looking for Logan Reed and evidence against Brent Sawyer." Logan staggered to his feet, offering the phone with the files. "It's all here. Everything you need." Sawyer, defeated, spat at the agent's feet. "You can't prove a thing. This is all a setup." But the agents ignored him, snapping handcuffs on his wrists as officers rounded up the rest of his men, who had been flushed out by the show of force. The clearing became a frenzy of radios, shouts, and questions as the law swept in at last, gathering evidence, offering medical aid, and bringing order back to chaos. One paramedic rushed to Shadow, examining his wounds with gentle hands. "He's lost a lot of blood," the medic said, voice grave. "We need to get him to a vet, now." Maddie's face crumpled in terror and relief. "He's going to be okay, right? He has to be okay." Rachel knelt beside her daughter, pulling her close. "He's strong, sweetheart. He's a hero." As the authorities led Sawyer and his men away, Logan stood with Rachel and Maddie, relief and exhaustion carving deep lines into his face. The evidence was in the right hands. Justice, at long last, was moving forward. Shadow, weak but still conscious, looked up at Maddie, his gaze soft. The little girl stroked his muzzle, whispering, "Thank you. You saved us." The paramedics lifted Shadow onto a stretcher, and Rachel, Maddie, and Logan were hustled into the back of a rescue vehicle, sirens wailing as they sped toward the nearest animal hospital. Rachel's hand never left Maddie's. Maddie's never left Shadow's fur. As the flashing lights faded into the distance, the nightmare receded, but the cost was plain on every face. Rachel held Maddie close, whispering comfort, her eyes never leaving Shadow's battered body. Logan squeezed Rachel's shoulder, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time, hope was more than a distant dream. It was real, hard-won, and as fragile as the breath of a wounded dog resting in the arms of the child he loved. The fight was over, but the journey toward healing, forgiveness, and the rebuilding of shattered lives had only just begun. After the last of the sirens faded and the adrenaline ebbed from Rachel's blood, a strange, hollow quiet filled the ambulance. They sped down winding roads toward the animal hospital, Maddie cradling Shadow's heavy head in her lap. The German shepherd, blood-matted and barely conscious, offered a feeble wag of his tail at the sound of her voice. Rachel pressed a trembling hand to Maddie's shoulder, afraid that if she let go, she might lose her daughter to the same numbness pressing on her own chest. Beside her, Logan sat with his eyes closed, hand wrapped in fresh gauze. His face was gray with pain and exhaustion, but his presence offered a silent kind of comfort, a reminder that they were no longer running alone. The ambulance rocked and swayed. Maddie kept whispering, "It's okay, boy. We're here. Stay with me, please." Her small hands shook as she stroked his fur, her words half lullaby, half desperate prayer. The EMT riding with them shot a look at Rachel, a look she recognized, full of compassion, but with the hard truth that sometimes love alone is not enough to change fate. They reached the hospital as the sky softened from gray to gold. Shadow was lifted gently onto a gurney and rushed inside. Maddie tried to follow, but a nurse knelt down, soft but firm, and explained that only doctors could be with Shadow now. Maddie broke down, clinging to Rachel as sobs racked her thin body. For hours, time hung in limbo. Rachel sat in the hard plastic chairs of the waiting room, Maddie curled in her lap, Logan a steady presence nearby. Nurses came and went. The minutes stretched, elastic and merciless, each one thick with the hope that Shadow would pull through, and the dread that he wouldn't. Rachel's thoughts spun in endless circles. She relived every moment since the first stormy night. Maddie's insistence that someone needed help, the desperate rescue by the tracks, Logan's warnings, the chase, the betrayal, the impossible courage of a wounded dog who wouldn't leave a little girl's side. Guilt gnawed at her. Had she made the right choices? Had her stubbornness put Maddie in harm's way? She replayed her failures on a loop, unable to find answers. Maddie barely spoke, her energy burned out by fear and grief. She pressed Shadow's collar to her chest and stared through the window at nothing, eyes red and unfocused. Rachel tried to soothe her, but Maddie seemed to drift farther away, retreating into a silent world of loss. Logan did what he could, offering gentle encouragement, sharing news from the authorities. But even his presence was just another shadow in the hollow space left behind. The vet finally emerged, face grave but kind. Rachel stood on shaky legs, Maddie clutching her hand. "Shadow's stable for now," the vet said softly, "but he's lost a lot of blood. He's an old dog. We've done everything we can. If he makes it through the night, that will be a miracle." Maddie nodded, biting her lip. "Can I see him?" The vet hesitated, then led them to a quiet room where Shadow lay, an IV in his foreleg, his breathing ragged. Maddie knelt by his side, whispering secrets only they could share. Rachel placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, feeling her heart break in the way Maddie shook. As the hours dragged on, Rachel watched the monitors, the slow rise and fall of Shadow's chest. She remembered every kindness the dog had shown Maddie, the gentle nudge, the way he'd protected her in the storm, the fierce courage that had saved their lives more than once. She remembered, too, the softness in his eyes, the way he'd refused violence even when threatened. It seemed impossible that something so brave could be so fragile. When Shadow's breath slowed and his body relaxed for the final time, Maddie let out a cry so raw it broke Rachel's heart. She gathered her daughter into her arms, rocking her gently, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The drive home was silent, the world outside washed clean by rain. The farmhouse felt empty when they returned, as if the very walls missed Shadow's quiet strength. Maddie drifted from room to room, Shadow's old collar clutched in her fist. She wouldn't go outside. She didn't speak to her friends. Sometimes Rachel found her curled up under the table or in the old armchair by the fireplace, staring at nothing, her grief heavy and silent. Rachel struggled too, haunted by what they'd survived, plagued by the loss that came at the end. She stayed up late into the night, lying awake beside Maddie, wondering if she had done enough, if she could have saved Shadow, if she could ever help her daughter heal. Logan visited often, bringing groceries and stories, updates from the investigation. Sawyer and his men were in jail now, and the files Logan had risked everything for were making headlines. People in town spoke of Shadow as a hero, of the little girl and the dog who stood up to evil. Rachel tried to take comfort in that, but the house still felt hollow without his presence. One afternoon, Rachel found Maddie in the backyard, sitting beneath the tree where Shadow used to nap. She approached quietly, sitting down beside her daughter. For a long while they said nothing, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves. Finally, Maddie spoke, her voice small and lost. "Why do good things go away, Mom? Why did Shadow have to die?" Rachel's throat tightened. She pulled Maddie into her arms, stroking her hair. "I don't know, honey, but I do know that loving someone, even when it hurts, is what makes us who we are. Shadow loved you so much, he'd do anything to keep you safe. That love doesn't disappear. It's always here." She pressed Maddie's hand to her own heart. They sat together, letting the silence do what words could not. Over time, Maddie began to talk more, asking questions, sharing memories. Rachel listened, grateful for every small sign that her daughter's heart was healing, piece by fragile piece. The weeks stretched into months. The pain faded to an ache, sometimes flaring in the dark, sometimes softened by laughter or a memory. Rachel found herself talking to Shadow sometimes, telling him about their day, thanking him for watching over Maddie. She wasn't sure if Maddie did the same, but every now and then, she saw her daughter whispering into the twilight, a quiet smile on her face. Slowly, hope crept back into their lives. Logan became a fixture, a friend, a protector, a gentle presence who never pushed too hard. He and Rachel spent evenings on the porch, talking about the future. Sometimes Maddie joined them, curled up with a book or drawing in the fading light. Shadow was gone, but his spirit lingered, a quiet guide in the darkness, a reminder that courage could take many forms, that the bonds of love could outlast even the deepest grief. And though the wound was still raw, Rachel began to believe that one day they would be whole again. Winter faded, slowly and stubbornly, from the hills around the Evanses' farmhouse. The fields that had lain gray and desolate during those terrible weeks after Shadow's death began to shimmer green with the first promise of spring. Each day, the light lingered a little longer, and Maddie's voice, once so soft it barely left her lips, grew steadier, brighter, braver. Still, Rachel often worried that something essential had been lost in those dark days, that a part of her daughter's wild and gentle spirit had been changed forever by loss. There were nights when the old ache returned, creeping into the edges of Rachel's dreams. Sometimes she woke to the sound of Maddie whimpering, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, whispering for Shadow in the dark. Rachel would hold her close, pressing her lips to her daughter's temple, offering silent prayers to a universe that sometimes felt indifferent and cold. There were days, too, when the house felt too quiet, when the spaces Shadow had filled seemed to swallow every scrap of joy, every echo of laughter. Rachel wondered if this was what grief would always feel like. A shadow, always there, sometimes receding, sometimes stretching long in the late afternoon sun. But as spring deepened, changes began to take root. One bright Saturday morning, Logan arrived earlier than usual, a wide grin on his face and a battered cardboard box cradled in his arms. Maddie met him at the porch, curiosity sparking in her eyes for the first time in weeks. "What's that?" she asked, voice tentative but hopeful. Logan knelt and gently opened the box. Inside, 4 German shepherd puppies tumbled over each other, eyes bright, tails wagging. "These were rescued from Sawyer's compound," Logan explained, his gaze flicking to Rachel for approval. "They needed a new home and, well, one of them seems to have already picked you." Maddie's hand trembled as she reached into the box, A shy, gangly pup with a bold white blaze down his chest crept forward, nuzzling Maddie's palm. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Rachel watched as something like sunlight spread across her daughter's face, a look of recognition, of forgiveness, of hope. "He looks like Shadow," Maddie whispered, tears sparkling in her eyes. Logan nodded. "He does, but he's got a little something extra, I think." He smiled, and Rachel felt the heaviness in her chest lighten, just a bit. Maddie scooped the puppy into her arms, holding him close, breathing in the warm scent of fur and life. "What's his name?" Rachel asked, her own eyes stinging. Maddie was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "Comet. He came down from the sky, just for us." From that moment, Comet became Maddie's constant companion. Where she went, he went, bounding through the greening fields, chasing butterflies in the yard, curling up at her feet while she did her homework. The house filled with laughter again, the crash of a puppy skidding on the kitchen floor, Maddie's delighted shrieks, the gentle grumbling of Logan pretending not to spoil Comet with treats. Even Rachel caught herself smiling more, finding joy in the smallest things, a paw print on the porch, a wagging tail at the door. Still, there were reminders. Some nights, Comet would curl up beside Maddie's bed, and she would whisper stories into his fur. Stories about a brave dog named Shadow who had taught her what it meant to be strong and gentle at the same time. Rachel would listen from the doorway, heart swelling with bittersweet pride. The pain of loss hadn't vanished, but it had transformed, becoming a kind of strength, a quiet reminder that love endures, even in absence. Logan became a part of their lives, woven in by shared hardship and healing. He fixed things around the house, taught Maddie how to train Comet, and filled the evenings with stories, some sad, some funny, all honest. He never tried to replace what was gone, but he honored it, and in doing so, helped Rachel and Maddie find a new rhythm. There were awkward moments, fits of silence, bursts of laughter that came out of nowhere. Gradually, the three of them became something like a family. Not the family Rachel had once imagined, but something hard-earned and real the town, too, remembered. Shadow's story spread. The dog who had saved a child, stood up to cruelty, and shown mercy even when he had every reason to bite back. Kids at Maddie's school would ask her about him, and she would tell them, not just about the scary parts, but about how Shadow had protected her by loving, not by fighting. Sometimes a teacher would pull Rachel aside, mentioning that Maddie had stood up for another child or comforted someone who was sad. "She's different," they'd say. "She's strong." One afternoon, as the sky burned with the colors of sunset, Rachel sat on the porch with Logan, watching Maddie and Comet chase each other across the yard. The air was thick with the scent of grass and lilac, and for the first time in months, Rachel felt at peace. "She's doing better," Logan observed, his voice low. "You both are." Rachel nodded, wiping away a tear she hadn't noticed. "It's still hard some days. I don't think it ever really goes away." "It's not supposed to," Logan said. "You don't heal by forgetting. You heal by remembering, by carrying the good things with you." Rachel smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "I think you're right." As the last light faded, Maddie ran up the steps, Comet trailing behind. "Mom, Logan, watch this!" She laughed, spinning with the puppy in her arms, her joy as bright as the stars flickering to life above the trees. Rachel looked at her daughter, her brave, resilient, beautiful child, and felt a rush of gratitude. "You're safe," she whispered. "You're whole and you're loved." That night, as Rachel tucked Maddie into bed, Comet curled up at her feet. Maddie whispered, "Shadow's still here, Mom. He's in my heart. He always will be." Rachel brushed a kiss across Maddie's forehead. "He is, sweetheart. He's part of us forever." Outside, the world was wide and wild and full of unknowns. But inside their small farmhouse, the torch of love and courage burned bright, passed from shadow to comet, from heartbreak to hope. They had survived the storm. They had learned to heal. And though life would never be simple, they had found a way to keep loving, to keep hoping, even when the world tried to break them. As Rachel stood at the window, watching Maddie and Comet sleep beneath the soft moonlight, she finally understood the lesson Shadow had left behind. True courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to love fiercely, even when you know the cost. And in that, they were truly, finally free.